Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Towards Data Science podcast. Now, AI ethics is something that often confuses people. It's often treated as a dry, abstract, and academic subject, and it doesn't really have the kinds of consistent, unifying principles that you might expect from a quantitative discipline like computer science or physics. One way or another, the ethics rubber has to meet the AI road, and where that happens, where real developers have to deal with real users and apply concrete ethical principles, is where you find some of the most interesting practical thinking on the topic. And that's why I wanted to speak to Wendy Foster, the Director of Engineering and Data Science at Shopify. Now, Wendy's approach to AI ethics is refreshingly concrete and actionable, and based on clear principles like user empowerment, the idea that you should never force your users to make one decision or another, but design user interfaces that frame AI recommended actions as suggestions that can be ignored or acted on. Now, Wendy joined me to discuss her practical perspective on AI ethics, the importance of user experience design for AI products, and how responsible AI gets baked into product at Shopify on this episode of the Towards Data Science podcast. Although we do a lot of this podcast about responsible AI, even AI safety and AI alignment type stuff, one of the cool things about Shopify is you're having to put a lot of this stuff into practice, maybe not the technical alignment things, but responsible AI for sure. So I'm looking forward to diving into that. I think that's going to be a really cool part of this. But I'd love to start with maybe a more biographical question, because you have a big job at a big company in a really big space. I'd love to understand how you came to where you are today. Like, what was your journey?
Yeah, through actually a meandering journey. And I think at like Shopify, we call this like the career like jungle gym. And I probably exemplify this like more acutely than like most folks. So I started out actually like in the humanities. So I have a doctorate in literature and cultural studies. But a big part of like my interest in work when I was engaging in that research was technology like studies. So in like essentially I have a hacker like mentality toward like the field I now like am situated in, taught myself how to like code. And after I got my doctorate, I made the decision, as so many do, like that I did not want to remain in academia. I actually wanted to connect like myself to like praxis, like a bit more materially. And I wanted to work in like industry, and I wanted to like be able to explore like the connections and passions I had for like the technology space, back to like the critical like thinking training I had acquired with like my humanities like research. So I ended up doing, I'll call it a technology like program. I was going to say a technology adjacent program, but it wasn't. I did a Master's of Interactive Arts and Technology at Simon Fraser University, which changed my direction, my life, and the way I thought about like my practice. Such an incredible like interdisciplinary like program. My goal was to actually enter into like game design, but my lab was it was a game lab, but it was like very data like focused. So I got exposed to in-game like data telemetry, how to understand user behavior within like game environments, and also like information visualization. I was kind of obsessed with like heads-up displays and how to communicate like information meaningfully in small spaces. And that's like the strange way I got connected to like the data space. And I moved from BC back to like Ontario, and my first job in technology was with Kobo, and as a content analyst, and a big portion of that was data visualization. So career progression, I guess, um, just a naturally like evolved from like there. It was a whole bunch of like I think beautiful accidents. Yeah.
Well, actually, it's interesting. You highlighted that connection to praxis, which at least I take to mean practice. I think most people, from a non-academic background or who don't look at or don't have a background in the humanities, I mean, praxis is one of those terms that comes up a lot in that context. What does that really mean for you on a day-to-day basis when you're talking about building, applications or models, machine learning models, whatever it is? How do you where's that connection? Where does that happen?
Yeah, like for me, it was like it could be distilled in like meaningful like connection with like the real world, not just like in like the at the application like layer, but in the outcomes you're trying to like drive. And I think outcomes you're trying to drive is slightly different from the problems you're trying to solve for like your end user. And in Shopify's case, like our merchants, and that is actually like what shapes the technological solution versus the technology like component like driving the application or the end like feature to like the users, because like often we like flip it, we want to like be able to explore and experiment with exciting new like technologies and technology like stacks, and our end user like problem becomes like a side artifact of that exploration. So for me, it's important that the merchant or the end user always comes first and is at the center of our solutioning.
So I find that really interesting. It's the kind of thing you do tend to hear from people after really kind of make the rubber meet the road, where it's not about, can I use GPT-3 in the back end or can I use something fancy? It's about, what can I build? So how does this manifest in like specific trade-offs that you've made in choosing architectures or choosing even problems to solve?
Yeah, so like this is partly, I think, like just good practice, but it's also a guiding principle for like Shopify development, and that's like simplicity. And so like, clearly when we're making like technology choices or like architectural like choices, we're taking into consideration like technical like trade-offs around like cost optimization and complexity. But I think like the bigger like orientation is around like what do we like need to build to provide like the quickest and best value back to like our merchants. And it's always like a bit of a learning centered exercise around that. So I know like one of like the newer features we released, like leveraging like some modeling work we had done around product like classification as an example. I think like I was talking to like someone at work about this before. It's like the exploration phase was like relatively like constrained, so there wasn't like a push to like explore large language like models. The team really like looked to like orient itself around like getting like the best like solution to provide like that merchant value. So accuracy was like a piece of it, but like what do we need to solve the merchant like problem? It wasn't a foundational research exercise. So yeah,
Yeah,
simplicity. This solved our problem well. Yeah.
and I imagine that that has some implications as well for what we think of as ethical AI, responsible AI, just because simpler solutions tend to be more interpretable. Is that part of this as well, or?
Yeah, and like I think that it is, but I don't know that that's front of like mind for
Mhm.
people. I don't know when we say like a guiding principle of development at Shopify is simplicity, that we're like actually like stating this is because this gives us like actually good like visibility and interpretability or explainability around like the solutions we're providing. You kind of get that for free, I think, as you're suggesting, with like simpler like approaches. And those approaches also tend to be like the most like effective, as I said, for like the value generation. I'll probably be like a bit of like a wheel around that, but I'm kind of like, I mean, uh, merchant centeredness is like a core Shopify value, but it's one of the reasons I joined the company too, because I'm obsessed with this like merchant spirit, right? And centering like that problem space. Yeah.
And actually, I guess part of that is to understanding the psychology of the merchants who use these tools, right? I imagine, like, one thing that I was wondering about was when you have such a big company and you have so many different merchants from different walks of life, some of them are going to be in their like 70s or whatever, some of them are going to be young people. And so I imagine there are different levels of comfort and familiarity
Yeah.
with what AI is, and yeah, and willingnesses to take on the recommendations that Shopify offers. And then in some cases, like maybe over comfort with or sort of overconfidence in the recommendations of algorithms. So, like, how do you think about trust building with that consumer, or not consumer base, with the merchant base?
Yeah, I think that's like a really like great question. So I'll try and unpack it a bit and tell me if I like start like or stop making like any sense. It's like from like a merchant like trust building like exercise, like I kind of like default in conversations back to like describing to people how we actually like internally discuss like let's say our recommendation like portfolio, right? And internally we don't actually call them recommendations, we call them suggestions. So this is a very, very intentional like language choice. And it's also by design. And design is also like a very important like concept in this discussion too. So if I go back to like the suggestion piece, like our end goal with like considering how we can like help guide like merchants to like better actions or reduce toil around certain of their operational like workflows, we always want to be I think like a helper agent versus like a prescriptive automated feature. As an example, if that makes sense. So I think you build trust when you say, hey, like we're actually wanting to like learn from you. And here's also like the visual cues that tell you we're not actually locking you into like an action. You actually have agency to reject a suggestion or allow it to like autocomplete, like in some cases, depending on how we're representing that back to like the user. You have full control over like your workflow, but we think we can help you like get your job done faster. And in some cases, like more effectively.
Actually, yeah, I really like that philosophy just because there's so much talk in AI ethics about principles that are fuzzy and hard to pin down, and then when it comes time to apply them, nobody really knows how to apply them or what they mean. Whereas in this case, it's sort of just outsourcing a lot of that to the cognition of your merchant and saying, hey, we can give you some suggestions, some nudges, but we can't tell you what to do.
So I would just suggest too that in many cases we don't want to tell them what to do, because another big component around the trust building, like to your point about the diversity of our merchant base, I think one thing that is common about them is that they're fierce. Right, they're fierce learners and they're drivers like for their like own success. So they take like really deep like advantage of the educational opportunities we also provide with like our features. This is clearly something that's incredibly important for like machine learning driven features. It's like, what is this doing? How is it doing it? Why should you like attend to it? You know, what other choices do you have available to you if it doesn't match your expectations, right?
Yeah, actually, that's an interesting post-selection feature because you're offering a product to merchants, to entrepreneurs who have that mindset that, you know what, I'm going to figure this out. I'm going to unbox this and like crack it open. It kind of, it's an interesting part of sort of machine learning design because you know your end user has that quality. So maybe you can get away with a little bit more in terms of offering them education, expecting them to figure more stuff out themselves.
Yeah, and I don't know, to be fair, if that's available in like every industry.
Mhm.
We talk a lot like at Shopify authentically about like the entrepreneurial like spirit, and in conversations I've had with like merchants, it's like their drive to like fully own all of the facets of their business, even the ones that are like challenging to them, and how to like leverage us and ask us for like the features they need to support their operations like more effectively, like is actually like pretty exciting space. Like they want to learn hard things,
Yeah.
right? And so like I think like the challenge of like our jobs is how to build like those like scaffolds without ever talking down to our merchants, right? They want us to like guide them, but not like overlead them, like not micromanage like their tasks, right?
I have a lot of conversations with folks who do kind of policy making, and one thing that comes up a lot is explainable AI, and then they'll treat like the concept of an explanation as if it's some monolith, something that already has a meaning independent of the person you're explaining to. And one of the funny things I find when you talk to people who actually do this on the ground with real users is that they'll tell you there's no such thing as a single kind of explanation. Depending on who the end user is, you have to offer different levels of explanation. And it just becomes so unavoidable. And this seems like such a great example of just that.
Yeah, and I think you hit the nail on the head. And like, I'm remiss here because I don't remember the source, but there's been a recent like conversation about like actually putting us like a little bit at a discursive like distance from like ideas of explainability and interpretability, and instead like refocus our attention on observability.
Mm.
right, which is I think where we have like a better opportunity both to like educate like end users around like ML driven like assistive like features or things that are like more deep, give them actually like a viewport into like how these like features like or algorithms actually like work and where they have control over aspects of like those features. Like there was one it's kind of like a DevOps like tool I was like exploring a couple of like years ago that actually exposed the parameters, like, or some of the key parameters of the model underlying the anomaly detection system back to the end user. It did offer like extensive documentation explaining like how these parameters like worked to create different like outputs from like the model and let you play with them. And like I think some of the safeguards around it, although I couldn't dig too deeply like into it, was that they didn't let you like, you know, move a threshold like so wildly that it would give you like, you know, incorrect like outputs, but it let you select like the algorithm you wanted to like overlay over like the problem, and some of the parameters exposed as well, which I thought was really, really cool and challenging and hard. But you know, hands-on learning is like the best. Give people some control over their outputs. Yeah.
And what do you see as that distinction between explainability and observability and interpretability?
Yeah, I think like with explainability, like maybe this is like a complexity like piece. I think it, like to your earlier point, it's like there's different layers of explanation you need for different like technical like competencies that I think like overwork the goal you're trying to like achieve, right?
Mm.
Observability into things that are more understandable to people. Like I think even like I found even with like non-technical stakeholders, like being able to sit in front of someone and show them like a distribution curve of like data is far more like explanatory to them than like the explanatory outputs of like a model, which they're not interested in
Yeah.
unless it can be translated in a way that helps them understand how they can like do their job to do their job better, or what decision they need to make given access to this explainability, right? Like I don't think we should like discard it. It should be like part of like the palette of us being like more responsible with what we put out into the world, but like finding better ways to make like the observability piece around the solutions we're building like is actually really exciting to me. And there's an operational component around that too that like I love. It like connotes that we're monitoring something, we're attending to it. Explanations like we can ingest and then discard, right?
Right.
Something that's observable we can attend to for like longer, I think.
Yeah, it almost seems like there's an interactivity piece with the observability side of things where the model
Yeah,
becomes more of a toy, or the data set or the
yeah,
visualization.
yeah. I really like how like you frame that. Yeah, you the ability to interact with someone, see how it changes when you manipulate a piece of it, I think is a far stronger like teaching mechanism than other forms we currently engage.
Feels also kind of empowering too to the end user, because if I imagine myself like looking at the sort of static output of some interpretability thing where it's like, oh, these are the most important features, and you kind of don't know what to do with it. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And like I think that that's like part of like a point of frustration for me too, is that like does knowing that allow me as an end user to change anything,
Right.
or to, yeah, I don't know how else I want to wrap words around that, but it's like I don't know, like you're using all the right language. I think like there's not like it's missing like the empowerment component. I can see it, and then I potentially still feel like helpless around like what to do with this information, right?
And I imagine there's almost a positive, I want to call it almost ethical side to this, where you're helping the user build a better mental model of when they should trust the system and when they shouldn't. Because if you just get the interpretability stuff or the explanation, it's not like that invites any thoughts about like oh well, when does this parameter start to become problematic? Like if I tune it this way, oh, all of a sudden these price predictions make no sense or whatever. Whereas if you're actually playing with it, you get a sense for the sensitivity of like the input output sensitivity of whatever system you're dealing with, and you can kind of go, okay, well, when I prodded it in this way, I got reliable results. When I prodded it in this way, I didn't. So I'm going to trust this data a little bit less and this data a little bit more, maybe that sort of thing.
Yeah, and I think that that's like correct, and I think like also another like interesting piece around it that um, I I I'm gonna say I think you're like suggesting this in a way too, but like tell me if I'm way off base, is that there's something like integral around like the design of like that experience or that interactive like experience that's like crucial too. So when I was talking like earlier about how internally like we frame like recommendations as suggestions, it's not just like a language like choice, which I do think is like important in terms of the development like process, but it also like inflects how we like represent that work or surface it back to like the end user. So like a thing that I've been thinking a lot about that is really important that I don't know that we make like vivid to like our stakeholders is that when we're like, I'm thinking of like product like type suggestions as an example, because it's what I've been most recently like thinking about, and how we display like product type categorization suggestions back to our user. There's like basically like a little search box, and like when they're going through their operational, when a merchant is going through their operational like workflow to select like a product like category for their piece of like merchandise, we'll give them a suggestion that maps to like Google product like taxonomy, and this has like tons of like external like world like benefits for them around the standardization of that product type. But we display that suggestion to them in a very light gray like font color, right? And
Mm.
like the importance of that to me is that we're saying, hey, we think this is going to be helpful to you, but you should have experience with like search boxes that when something is like very, very light gray, you can either like allow it to autocomplete itself if you start like, agreeing with that suggestion, or you can be like, this doesn't work for me. I'm going to pick something else. And that's the affordance that's built into like that feature. And I'm like, I think that like there's clearly like choices you can make that can more strongly like enforce a decision. And like I like the gentleness of saying, does this help you? And then we get like the learning from, did they reject it? Like
Right.
what did they put in like elsewise? How can we use this to like actually improve the quality of the suggestion going forward? And like maybe we can get to a point where they're like, these are really good, they're like highly accurate for me. Is there an option where I can just like default to this?
It's just getting excited about the prospect of seeing the emergence of a more mature form of machine learning that involves user experience design tightly coupled to.
Yes, yes, yes. And there was like again, like I don't know if you maybe remember, there was like a meetup group that Normative used to sponsor, which was designed for AI. It was incredible. It was like I think one of like the best like meetups like I've ever attended for like a couple of years. And because my excitement is like localized around exactly like what you're suggesting, is that actually like I think the most important part of any like algorithm, if we're talking about like consumer facing like products, is the user experience around it. It's a make or break. I think both for like the success of like the algorithm, because there's, it's not just like an internal joke that like offline testing doesn't match like online testing, but
Yeah.
it's because we're not able to like anticipate like the human behavior with the technologies that like we build until they're actually in like the wild and being used, right? So one thing I've learned is that we can't exist as a successful discipline if we're building use and value for like end users without full end-to-end participation of like UX in the decisions we're making.
And then that's its own interesting question is, so for this sort of thing, do you tend to take a user experience designer and then train them in ML, or do you take like a data scientist and train them in UX, or is it just a collaboration? What's the most effective way of doing this, do you find?
Yeah, well, I'm super fortunate because the senior like UX like lead I get to work with like every day at Shopify is an engineer by like training and very articulate and adept in like both the language and the application of like machine learning. So I consider her like a close like collaborative like partner, right,
Nice.
from the beginning of like inception, and like her input on the algorithmic like choices we make is like as useful and like valuable as like trained data scientists. And on the other side of that, I also feel very lucky because we have data scientists at Shopify who have PhDs in philosophy and sociology. So we've really been like leveraging folks in like our field who are working with us, who come from like embedded like backgrounds and thinking about these kinds of like socio-technical like problems to help us shape and like mature our code of conduct toward how we develop like machine learning. So yeah, there's like, I think there's like an excitement on like the UX side where we already have like people in place who can like evangelize like that knowledge through their craft, but also on like the data science side, folks who like cross like disciplinary boundaries who bring us to greater states of like awareness around how we can build frameworks so that we can design better, both from a user interface perspective, but from an algorithmic perspective as well.
Yeah, this really seems like one of those areas, like because I've spoken to a lot of AI ethicists on the podcast and elsewhere, and it does seem as though academia can get locked into certain paradigms because it doesn't tend to get exposed to user interaction. This whole area, I mean, it seems so exciting because it pokes directly at solutions to problems that are considered open, but that in some ways don't seem like they have to be. Like there is a sense in which outsourcing some of the responsibility for analysis, for understanding, for observing and interpreting can be done to the end user. And this like kind of unblocks a lot of the kind of ethical questions around what do we prioritize, what do we surface first. I'm curious, like what some of those conversations sound like. Like what are some of the day-to-day discussions that you'll have with some of these like PhDs in more kind of ethical or ethics type research, sociological, technological stuff, who are also working on the technology like for real with users? Like what are some of the, let's say, some of the latest things you've been thinking about or talking about, some challenges that you've been discussing in that context?
Yeah. So from like a practice perspective, is like our checklists, like are there, well, I'm gonna like kind of talk around this because like I don't know how to describe it like really accurate, because there's kind of like two places. There's like on the operation of how we do our work in our business, like how do we actually like create like decision making like frameworks that help people make the right decisions like upfront, that put us in a better position than if we hadn't thought about those concerns previously. That's a lot of words. So I'll summarize it to say it's like we, like many other organizations of our size, and I think even smaller ones, who care about building like best in class machine learning like products. We have like a framework and a checklist that like we want our developers to like use, that like are designed by folks with like both experience in like the field as well as in sociology and philosophy, on like how to create like out of the box like ethical like approaches to like the work we do. I think that that's important. And like I connected very closely, like I was talking to someone from like our security team about like why I think this is so important. And I think, and I'm like, because otherwise like you're offloading the thinking about it to like a muscle that I don't know that we've built yet. Right. So with
Mm.
security, often like you'll get like for trust and security operations, like what's super useful to a team is to have like a checklist of things they need to think about so that when they're building and designing like applications, like end user like security is front of mind, because otherwise you might like miss those. We haven't built that muscle yet where privacy by design is like part of our thinking. And so in this respect, it's like ethics by design or machine learning, like ethics by design. Let's make this part of our practice, that we think about like these particular like I call them like productive like constraints, make us
Yeah.
innovate differently. for the work. And the other conversations that they like sponsor, I think, are like the required ones where it becomes a part of like the communication culture of like your craft, right? So we have like a technical like leadership group for data science at like Shopify. Ethical like AI is one of its like working groups, and so they're constantly like educating and evangelizing like what this means, what does this look like for like how we build across our organization, and kind of centering some of those like catalyzing policy decisions within our best and brightest. And like I'll say like the technical like working group is individual contributors or practitioners, right? This hasn't been like downloaded to like middle management or executive. This is fully driven by the people who are building our solutions, which is, I think, where it needs to be located.
Yeah, this just reminds me of the advice that we always got in Silicon Valley was, any aspect of your company culture that you do not explicitly set will get set for you. And you're not going to like the results in general because it'll get set like to maximum entropy, like the maximally
Right.
entropic version
Oh,
of that culture.
terrible.
But no, I mean, it sounds like that sort of formalization of that culture is a really big part of this, which makes perfect sense. It makes it also, I guess, more like easier to interrogate because you have these kind of formalized features of like, this is what we're trying to propagate. And if somebody disagrees with them, they have something to point to and you can have a more concrete conversation around that.
Yeah, I think so too. And I also like think it's just like generally like part of our like jobs in like growing the next like generation of like data science like leaders, both within our organizations, but within our larger community, to be like driving like those conversations and like those positions, and also like not feeling afraid to like push back on like where they see like challenges or blockers to being able to like move this kind of thinking but like forward. Like it creates like thought leaders out of like our best. Like
Yeah, and it sort of avoids this trap of, I guess, having some policies that are implicit, sort of not
oh,
scapegoats,
correct.
but yeah, like black boxes where people tend to shove their anxieties and their incompetences in these things that are like, oh, we'll send it off to the team that does X, and like the team that does X is kind of like, well, we do X prime, we don't do X exactly, but I guess we'll try, and then it doesn't get done right.
Yeah, and I think it's like incumbent on us, and like I'd be interested in your positions on it too, because like you work in like the learning space for like our field, and like are also like building like our next like generation of like leaders in this like space. So I know what we have to like in industry be able to inculcate like some kind of like thoughtful like autonomy around, and that's in like driving like our perspectives and our positions, like in this example on like responsible like AI. But like ideally I'd love to see it as part of like our core curriculum for how we train, particularly in computer science and emerging like data science like programs, which is present now, which never used to like exist. And like I know within like a lot of engineering and computer science programs, like training in ethics or social implications of like technology are not compulsory. They're not part of like your core curriculum. They're like things you may or may not like choose to like take. And um, this is interesting to me because I know, and I've also like I don't know how this happened to me, but at one point in grad school, I was TAing a civil engineering course. I don't know, but it
As
was
one
like an
does.
ethics. I honestly don't know how that one like happened, but it was like an ethics and engineering like course, and it was a required course for them, right? For the business like discipline like they were learning, it was like a critical like component of how the department wanted to like build their practice. And I always thought it was like, a little bit like sad and distressing that this wasn't seen to be true for other like disciplines like electrical engineering or computer science.
I wonder if part of this too is, when you do electrical engineering or computer science, it's these very concrete things, very quantitative. There's a sense in which everyone can agree what belongs in an electrical engineering curriculum, whereas it sometimes feels like, especially AI ethics, suffers from this mix of ponderousness and vacuousness in many contexts, where they're like conversations that are happening very airy, very abstract. Rarely the plane gets landed, and I find I've had messages from like listeners who ask questions about that. They're confused about like what is even AI ethics at this point, because it's so hard to put a box around it. This is, I think, where people who are in your position are really probably going to be exceptionally well placed to speak to this, because you actually, again, it's that rubber meets the road thing. Like, how do these things get instantiated in real company policy and real product? I'm curious, like, if you had to highlight, let's say, like 2 or 3 concepts from ethics, or 2 or 3 ideas that for you form part of the core of that like AI ethics structure, or even just more general kind of data science ethics, what do you think those things would be? I'm really curious, because I think you'll have an interesting lens on this.
I hope so, but like for me, like I think that they've been like the same for like a while now. I think even before I knew what like responsible like AI was, that's not a humble brag. It's just like I think coming from a humanities like background, I think what was most attractive to me, especially about machine like learning, was like the humanness of like the endeavor and the goal. I
Mm,
know that that's not like actually absolutely true, but it was like the goal for me. So like the centeredness of the human, and not in like kind of an enlightenment like humanist way, but like what we're actually like trying to like build and extend is like human like capabilities, and understand like the human like better, right? So the solutions like we build to meet, to I think to tie more tightly back to what you're asking, is that like I don't see like value, to be honest, in like orienting myself or my teams around like machine learning solutions to a problem just based on technical like curiosity, profit, or social control. So I
right.
think if we orient around like if the outcomes of like our work like are negatively like positioned against like those 3 like pillars, we're doing something like wrong from an ethical like perspective, right? And to
Yeah.
be like ethical in our practice, our goal should always be providing like the maximum non-harmful value back to humans, and that requires a lot of effort from us, right? So like foundation research, I think particularly, is like at such a huge distance from like the impacts and the effects of its like plowshare by like industry, that that to me needs to be built into like that work as well, because you know the outcomes can be negative. We should be exploring that as a component of our research, even though I totally understand and get like that like flow you get when you're just like you know immersing yourself in like the highly complicated problems and the technologies that we get to engage with. But like that's it's a bit of a lure, I think, that like
Yeah.
we need to avoid.
That's really interesting. I mean, it speaks to. I remember when I spoke to Solmaz, one of the things that jumped out at me was I was like, oh man, like data science at Shopify is an awful lot like being a startup founder. Like the way that, yeah, the way that user interactions are, like you're talking to your users, and it's just like part of the product. Like you cannot get away without talking to your users. Is this something that people need special training in? Do you find, or because data scientists sometimes just by what's the word, by temperament, tend to, can be more introverted, more insular maybe. Is this something that you have to kind of tease out of people, get them used to talking to real customers, or at least interacting with real customer preference information that's a little bit more hands-on?
Yeah. Yeah, it's like to your point, I think it's about creating like the safe spaces for people to begin to engage and like learn from like your merchants. So at Shopify, like merchant connectedness is a core like value. Our engineers and our data scientists are actually routinely like asking for like deeper connections with their merchants so they can help solve their problems like more effectively. And we're very, very fortunate because we have embedded like user experience and
Mm,
embedded like product, who if we like are uncomfortable making those merchant connections ourselves, will invite us like always into like their merchant like conversations. So when I say create a safe space for it, what I tell engineers and like data scientists, I'm like, just go and observe. you can have like your video off, let the product manager or the UX like lead direct the conversation, but like learn as much as you can from like how like the merchant is like directing like the conversation, right? And then once you participate in one or two like merchant conversations, it becomes like addictive. And like also
Yeah.
what I love that I think is special about our product and UX folks at like Shopify is that if I am like observing a merchant like conversation with like a UX lead, they will always give me like space to like ask questions and be able to like also like describe and share my perspective on what we're building, especially if it happens to be a machine learning driven or assistive like feature, back to the merchant and like walk them through it. So it's like I think it's participatory design without like potentially calling it that.
Yeah,
But yeah,
yeah.
we have a lot of excitement over it, and people who might feel like some amount of like caution or trepidation about like entering into those conversations typically lose it first conversation. Our merchants are like very, very down to earth.
Well, that's, yeah, and again, another benefit of the particular class of
I
person
think
that you're
so.
working with. I mean,
Yeah.
but it's also just one of these things where you get into like in a lot of businesses, the specialization is really kind of separates the builders from the customers.
I think like the expectation of like crafts like at Shopify are to participate like across like discipline, and encourage like uh yeah, encourage like those like cross craft like boundaries. So
That more kind of horizontal model, which I think, yeah, is anyway, I've seen it at like the more technical orgs where you really get a lot of distance. By the time information has to work its way up through like a user experience specialist, then a product manager, and then across to somebody else, and then down to somebody else, and you just lose so much in that game of telephone. It's also just more motivating, I guess, when you can talk to your user and see the impact of what you're building.
yeah, for me, like, and I think like this is like also what I've seen on like our teams, but like I think to like a larger point, like I totally get that there's some people who just want to like focus on like the execution of their particular like technical like space. So it's like I get that that's like a desire like as well, but like I do think like that was why like I wanted to leave like the research like silo, because the real benefit we get from like working in industry, especially for like user facing like products, is you were building and solving for like human problems, even if it's like a particular class of like human problems. And so I think it's to me, it's an expectation of like our jobs and our work, that we pursue that connection.
Would you have any recommendations for people who are, let's say, I guess there are two different camps I could imagine here. If you've got people who are on the AI capability side, who want to understand sort of the practical impact on people, like kind of get this sort of thing down, have ideas like, oh, well, I could take that button, I could fade it into gray and maybe turn this into a suggestion rather than a prompt or whatever. Do you have any thoughts about how people like that could put themselves in positions where they're interacting with people? Kind of, this might be a very kind of difficult thing to do because you almost need customers maybe by default, but it seems like such a valuable skill that it'd be worth cultivating.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like I almost feel like how would you like generate that on your own? I think in like most like organizations, even if it's not as like accessible, like that connection to like your end user as it is at like Shopify, by default. Like I've never worked in an organization where I couldn't connect with like my UX like person or like my product manager and ask to be like pulled into like those conversations,
Mm.
as I said, like as an observer or as like a participant, to be able to like learn more about that connection. I've known people who are like working on personal projects who like, sit in like subways and like basically like invite like discussion and feedback and want to show and demo people like what they're working on. And I will do another call out to Simon Fraser University, because in the CET program that I did, every single one of our courses involved a user study component. And I was in the quantitative like method stream too. Like, so we had user testing like built into like all of our like coursework. And that like taught me like lots about what you can like learn and how it actually shapes, like I think in more meaningful ways, like your end solution. And I wish more programs did that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I just brought that like mentality like out into like my working life. And yeah, it was hard at first because humans are scary.
Yeah, that's so true, and it's so easy to make up or come up with excuses not to talk to people. I find, like, I find this in myself, right? Yeah, you know, you'll do a piece of work and you're like, I'm really proud of this, it's perfect, and then somebody goes, oh, can I see it? And you're like, no, it's not ready for your eyes. There's it kind of feels like there's something going on in machine learning like that. Like, machine learning is just so fun too. It's seductive. You want to build, cool models, but
Yeah, and I see it as almost like a built-in like irony, because like we want to focus like big portions of like our efforts on modeling like human like behavior, and yet humans scare us. Um,
yeah,
yeah, it's a bit of
sad
like a
paradox.
built-in liability. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it seems, anyway, tons of take-home messages here, I think, for people who across the spectrum of even our listeners. I mean, we have some folks who are more just on the data science side. If you
Mhm.
want to get better at data science, get better at people, and this is a big part of that. On the AI safety side, I actually think this is something that is under examined or under thought of, like, how do real humans interact with real systems? And there are surprising results that you will discover when you actually see, these interactions in play. So I'm really glad that we had this conversation. So many cool insights here, Wendy. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I had such an incredible time.